So this picture shows how this could look like. On the south side, you can see the piers here with the container traffic, and here even some servicing vessels for the upcoming oil fields in Iceland. And here on this side, we could have oil depot and gas liquid treatment plant, and this is just a part of the possible development. I would like to use the opportunity to inform you that we at EPLA Consulting Engineers, we are very much looking into Alaska, and we are very strong in planning of infrastructure projects, not only in Iceland, also in the Scandinavian countries, and we have 8 offices abroad, down even to Dubai. We are doing power plants, geothermal, hydro, and we are strong in the power line business. And we are here looking for a partner because we would like to look into it to open an office here in Alaska. So if somebody in the room is interested to talk to me, then please do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Helgelson. That's that's not a unique thing with Iceland. I've recently talked to some Norwegian colleagues, and in Norway, there's a number of investments being made. There's a number of huge projects that I've become aware of and been briefed on that for infrastructure construction on some Norwegian islands as well. Obviously, we all know what the Russians are doing. So I think it's critically important when you look at where other nations are working, where they're putting their money where their mouth is, and where they're betting on the future. Again, it gives us pause here in Alaska to really understand what we're doing in the long run as well. Our next speaker will be Captain Cashin, Charlie Cashin from D17. Will be up to talk to us about the Coast Guard's perspective and what the Coast Guard's doing vis-a-vis these changes. But before I introduce Charlie, I do want to bring up one thing and have everybody look on their table and notice that there's like a globe there. Hopefully you saw that. I had enough coffee to pay attention to that. It's important when you look at that globe, I ask you to look at it from the top. So from the air hole on the top, or the zenith on the top. And I think it's important, and Alice put those out there for a reason, so that people can orientate themselves to the Arctic and the way things are set up. And when you get a perspective from that point of view of the world, it really does change the way you look at and understand the changes in the Arctic. When I was up here in D17, I had in my office, didn't have much in my office, but one of the things I did have was a cap or a three-dimensional map of the top of the world that I kept there, that I always used when people came in to point to them how close places like on Alaska were to Finland, or where traffic could move over the top, and what the Russians were doing. So please take some time and manhandle that globe on your table. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Captain Charlie Cashin from D17. Charlie.
Good morning. Give it just, there we go. Admiral, appreciate the introduction. Everyone, good morning. Thank you for letting me talk for just a few minutes. I was hoping to take the Admiral's broad comments and bring it down a little bit to a tactical level to look at what is going on in the maritime environment in the Bering Sea and the Arctic, and what some of the options are in the future for us to help manage the risk that goes along with that increasing maritime activity. Great, it works. A couple things I wanted to look at. I wanted to divide this activity up into 3 broad areas. We would look at trans-Pacific container shipments, we would consider the U.S. fishing fleet, and then we would consider activity in the Arctic that transits through the Bering Strait. Trans-Pacific, and the Admiral touched on this very well, wanted to look at the traffic that is coming to and from Asia and is destined for either the Canadian or U.S. Pacific coast. And we have 2 generally broad categories here. Those who are going into Prince Rupert or into Seattle, Tacoma, they will generally transit above the Aleutian Islands. And then those folks who are coming and heading more towards San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, they will be usually transiting just below the Aleutians. Either way, they still fall within our area of concern, but those who transit above bring a little bit more, because regardless of where they come into the Bering, if you're coming from Asia to the U.S., they'll come in through a variety of entry points in the Aleutian Islands, but there is a common choke point at Unimak Pass where everyone will usually enter or depart the Bering Sea. And we see about 4,500 transits of that location a year. And specifically for the Trans-Pacific folks, there are about 2,000 large ships that come through there annually. Looking at the time period from 2009 through now, that had been about 2,000, it dipped off a little bit, and then it increased to 2,200-ish, and it's a steady about 2,000 right now. And the reason for some of these variations, the Admiral touched upon, really relies on Prince Rupert and the development of that port. They started out somewhere around 500,000 TEUs, 20-foot equivalent, those small trailers that come across per year, and they're targeting to get up to about 2 million a year. And those then leave Prince Rupert on a rail system destined for Canada and the U.S. Midwest generally. Now, the way Prince Rupert is set up, they tend to accommodate slightly smaller vessels than we would see coming into Los Angeles and Long Beach, for example, where shipping companies are going to ever larger and larger ships to carry more and more cargo. That would bring down the numbers of trans-Pacific crossings. That's why some of that original drop-off that I mentioned. But with Prince Rupert taking some of that business away from those lower ports, they are moving not only that cargo north, but they're doing it on smaller vessels, and hence they need more of it if we're going to keep moving the same amount of cargo we're increasing. So that's why we're seeing it slowly start coming back up again, and again around the 2,000s right now, and as they increase, ostensibly that number would increase as well. Shifting from that, we will go up to the U.S. fishing fleet. And I mentioned the U.S. fishing fleet because, as I'm sure most folks are aware, the U.S. does not permit other nations to fish in the U.S. exclusive economic zone. And so it is purely a U.S. fleet depending on what species we are targeting. The changes that have occurred with the fishing fleet really have happened over the last 20 or 25 years or so, as we have gone from a derby-style fishing, and this is, again, regardless if we're talking crab or pollock or what have you, to more of a individual fishing quota. And that's where we will assign, we don't assign, they actually buy a certain amount of fish that each vessel can catch. And in addition to that, the time is expanded. So from the past, when you might have only a week to go out and catch however many crab, regardless of what the weather was, and hence if it's bad weather, you're increasing the risk to your boat and your crew, it's now over a much longer period of time. And so therefore you have the opportunity to sail in safer weather. And the benefit to Alaska and the marketplace is that you have a more consistent flow of product coming in. You're not flooding the market all at once in one period of time with a certain commodity, and then it goes away for another 6 months or another year. It's more drawn out over the year. And so it's safer, it is more rationalized. But what this means over the last 20 years or so is that the U.S. fishing fleet has generally settled out and become relatively stable. Now, there are a few things that may still affect that in the coming years, and those have yet to play out. One of those, for folks who have been following fisheries in Alaska, is bycatch. We have our large vessels that go out and bottom trawl, principally for Pacific cod and pollock, thank you very much, slipped there for a moment. They also bring up a fair number of other species that come along with that that's considered bycatch. It's not what they're targeting, and so by law they have to discard that. And two of the principal fish we're concerned with there are halibut and salmon. And so as those regulations tighten and the amount of bycatch they're allowed to recover and then discharge over the side gets smaller, the shape of that fishing fleet may change. In addition, speaking of the trawl fleet itself, that is one of the fisheries that has yet to rationalize and go to a quota system. Whether or not that happens is yet to be seen, and if it does, that may vary and help change what that fleet looks like. So those are a few things that are looking at within the U.S. fishing fleet. And then finally, we'll go up and talk about the Arctic, specifically those who transit through the Bering Strait. And there are three different areas I wanted to talk about here. We'll talk a little bit about the Northern Sea Route coming over Russia, the Northwest Passage over Canada and the US, and then the Bering Strait itself. But the Arctic in general, if we're looking at overall, north of the Bering Strait, we've seen about a 100% increase in vessel activity there during the summer and early fall months between 2008 and 2014. It has increased from approximately 120 vessels to what we expect this year to be approximately 250 vessels. Mostly tug and barge traffic along with petroleum carriers, tank vessels. And those are centered primarily within the U.S. Arctic, then followed by the Northern Sea Route, and then finally by the Northwest Passage. Although the numbers generally trend upward, please keep in mind that the absolute numbers still are relatively small. So even though one year to another you may see a 120, 130% increase, if we're talking about small numbers, we need to consider that in a different context. So speaking about the Northern Sea Route, folks who have been following Russia understand that the state is regulating this, and they are working through the Northern Sea Route Administration. They're actively managing this and trying to attract customers to come through there with their vessels under escort of Russian icebreakers, and they're setting up a logistics and a SAR infrastructure along the way. So if you envision the New Jersey Turnpike, you pay your toll to get on there, you're brought through. If you have issues, they have AAA there along the way to help you, and therefore to make it more enticing for folks to use this route to save both time and money. But I mentioned time, and that's one of the key factors here, because a lot of today's maritime commerce works in a just-in-time environment. And travel in the Arctic has not developed to a just-in-time model yet, simply because receding ice is not predictable, and it's certainly not consistent across the Arctic. And so when you have a timeline that is measured in hours, maybe a day, it is very hard to meet that type of schedule coming through the Arctic. So we tend to see more bulk cargo, things that can be processed on a when it arrives as opposed to a just-in-time basis. And that's the same both for the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. One thing I'll call out on the slide, you do see an asterisk there, but I think it's 2014. That is not the significant drop-off that it looks. What we're looking at now is trying to have a little more fidelity as we go through the numbers and differentiate those who are actually making complete Arctic crossings, which for the Northern Sea Route you can see is going from Karagates all the way through Pevek and down through the Bering Strait. And that's what that number indicates. The total number last year would have been 76, and those additional vessels would have been making interstate transit within the Russian Federation. And just for reference, because I do put up there the number of tons of cargo that folks are bringing across currently, what they're predicting. The Port of Anchorage right here in Alaska, last year in 2014 handled 3.5 million tons of cargo. So just to put into proportion the numbers that we have up there. Talking a little bit about the Northwest Passage now. Much less predictable than the Northern Sea Route. Why is that? Well, I already mentioned that the ice retreat in the Arctic is not homogeneous. It is different in different parts of the Arctic. That's made particularly so once you get above the United States and Canada, just because of the archipelago of islands that you have in there that tend to trap the ice and prevent it from melting or receding the way it would in the Northern Sea Route and above the Bering Straits. In addition to that, it is a more difficult navigational exercise to begin with, simply because it's not quite as open and straight of a transit as you would have over Russia. So that makes things a little bit different in the Northwest Passage. And then finally talking a little bit about Bering Straits transits. On the slide I have up here, this shows each line on there is an individual transit by a vessel in 2014. And there are different colors, however well that shows up, to show the different kind of vessels that we're looking at, whether it be tug and barge, petroleum carriers, or ships, things like that. You'll notice that generally the Russians stay on the Russian side, Those folks dealing on the U.S. side and Canada stay on our side. There is a little bit of an exception to that. You'll notice some of the purple traffic going right across one to the other. That's usually tug and barge coming out of Kivalina, taking product from Red Dog and heading over to Asia. But otherwise, they tend to stay on their side. Also, if you'll notice, 2012 shows an uptick in the amount of traffic going through the Bering Strait. And mind you, you're going to look at these and you're saying 400. Well, a moment ago, he said 200, 250. These numbers show multiple transit potentially by the same vessel. So while those numbers operating in the Arctic are counted, no matter how many times you come up, that's one time in the Arctic this year, this shows number of transits. 2012, that was the last year that Shell drilled in the Arctic. And so this year, for example, with their 2 drill rigs, Polar Pioneer, Noble Discoverer, they also bring a host of support vessels that work with those, approximately 26 other vessels, many of which may make frequent transits through the Bering Straits. And so those, we will predict, will increase the numbers for 2015 as well. So in summary, if we want to take all of this traffic, in summary for traffic, we can see that there is generally going to be an increase in vessel activity, and that is going to increase the risk. And it's going to increase the risk not so much because of an individual vessel, but because of the interaction of those vessels as they come together trying to occupy the same space at the same time. And this produces 2 primary concerns from the Coast Guard's perspective, and that is safety of life at sea and the potential for pollution. And so how do we want to respond to that? And I say we, not from the Coast Guard perspective, but from a whole of government, a whole of Alaska, a whole of enterprise, because it is more than just any one organization. And we look at this as a 3-legged stool that comes together to how we are working to help address some of this. And first and foremost upon that is the Polar Code that the International Maritime Organization passed in the end of 14, November of last year, with an amendment that came on there afterwards in March. And it's going to be effective, as the Admiral mentioned, in January of 2017. And this is going to improve place requirements upon the design and construction of ships that are going to operate in the Arctic. It's going to provide some guidance for what equipment and how that equipment will be used on vessels operating in the Arctic, and will specify operations and staffing and what kind of training the crews have to have. That way vessels operating in the Arctic are able to do so more capably and more safely.